the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello everybody, it is Monday, August the 5th. It's turning into quite a Monday. The global stock markets are in radical retreat, perhaps even collapse. And on the political front, riots in England, all sorts of interesting things happening in the United States, both on the left and the right. So in radical terms, perhaps politics is changing as dramatically as economics. And one man who understands that, I think, as well as anyone, is my guest today. He was on the show a few years ago, and I've always found his two books to be enormously useful in terms of making sense of what's happening in the world today politically. Edmund Fawcett is the author of Conservatism, The Fight for a Tradition, and Liberalism, The Life of an Idea. He is joining us from his home in Kensington in West London. Edmund, happy Monday to you.
To you.
There, of course, as we speak, you joked or half joked that there aren't any riots yet in Kensington. There are certainly in the north of England. How do the current anti-immigration riots or pogroms, whatever you want to call them, how do they fit into your narratives of conservatism and liberalism?
Well, they feel very bad. I mean, in many ways, they're quite horrific. They're not Kristallnacht. I think we need to have some sense of historical perspective here, but they are bad, and they reflect, to answer your question, very much what happens in politics when the media, the politicians, the elites, if you will, encourage a way of talking in politics and arguing that then encourages rioting and the throwing of stones. I mean, the idea that immigrants, people of a different faith, perhaps Muslims, are not welcome in Britain or are in some way not British, it's repellent, it's wrong. And for a time, it became rather unworthy to say so in public, particularly for politicians. But alas, in the last 20, 30 years, that kind of restraint has fallen away. And I think today, although no doubt the riots will stop, people will go to court, however, as it were, the civic damage is done. And I think the riots are evidence of what happens when that kind of restraint goes away.
I know, Edmund, you're in the early stages of writing a third volume on nationalism and cultural identity. But is this deep hostility to immigration, this fetishization of immigration, often imaginary in the UK, it certainly exists in the US and certainly in Central Europe. Absolutely. Isn't it an outgrowth of conservatism? Isn't it really the last volume of your book on the fight for a tradition? Why does it need a new book?
Well, I think the idea of being against immigration is many things. It's not one thing, and there's no one kind of immigrant. There never was and never will be. Using immigration as it were, a flag or a brand to unite a political. I think the first thing one has to do is look at the anger behind it and look at the social failings of people who are looking for some kind of political or social answers to their local problems, namely underfunded social services, overcrowded health services. And it's so easy to blame an outsider. That is that's pervasive. I mean, that happens in the United States. It happens across the west of Europe. It's happening here. But I think the link that and this is to answer your question, what is the link here to conservatism? I think anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner feeling feeds into a very common historic theme on the right that you see in all the 4 countries that I've worked in as a journalist and somewhat know a bit about: France, Germany, Britain, and the United States. And if you go back in the right-wing tradition there, when there was social trouble of all sorts of different kind, and there always will be, one of the easiest things for the conservatives to do was to blame foreigners. You saw that in, you saw that in Europe during the 1920s and 30s. You've seen it in our country, Britain, for many decades. It's not an answer to the local problems that many, many people face. And usually they're the people who aren't at the top of the pile, but they're fairly way down. They need those social services. They need those doctors' offices. They don't get them. But rather than thinking, how politically can we go about solving those, it's much easier to throw rocks at foreigners.
There's been a lot of talk here, Edmund. I'm sure you're following it carefully. On the right, with people like J.D. Vance. I'm not sure if he did it explicitly, but there's certainly someone close to Trump who's making an explicit comparison between the United States and Hungary, suggesting that if the US was like Hungary and ran what they think of, I guess, as a tight ship like Orban, didn't let immigrants in, then everything would be rosy. I'm guessing Farage and his people would be making similar arguments in the UK. What do you make of the rise of Orban? I'm not sure if we've really talked about that. The last time we talked was a few years ago. Orban was around. How does this, again, this fetishization on the right of Orban and what he is or isn't doing in Hungary, how does that fit into this narrative?
Well, Orban was an outlier, and it's interesting that he's become something of a beacon for the hard right. Just a sort of footnote, Budapest has become a outpost on the Danube for all sorts of very hard right institutes and groups, many of them subsidized, by the way, by the Hungarian state, which is itself, for a free market philosophy, quite amusing. But under various names, national conservatism, you name it, Budapest has become a beacon. But I'm not sure that Orban himself or his politics may be the most clear line here. No country's politics is ever quite like the other. I think J.D. Vance and people like him, professors like Patrick Deneen.
Your old friend, Patrick Deneen. I know you're a big fan of his.
I'm a big fan of his.
Well, he really brings out
it brings out
intolerance in even the most tolerant people like yourself. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., Liberalism for the 21st Century. I think you would have actually, some of the people there could have done with reading your book, but there was an interesting one panel on post-liberal critiques. And one of the people was Mark Lilla, who's a particularly tolerant NYU, I think he's a Columbia University intellectual historian. He's been on the show, delightful fellow and very smart. But he absolutely hates Deneen and his type. And I know you're not a big fan. Also,
I'm not a big fan. I've reviewed Deneen's books, and look, let's say the good stuff. Let's say the positive. He's very smart. He's bright. He's very eloquent. He knows how to. I wouldn't say he knows how to argue. He's rather slippery in argument, but he's extremely persuasive in the pulpit or at the rostrum. I've read, and I think I may have reviewed both his recent books, Why Liberalism Failed, and his most recent book, Regime Change. And they're very interesting because both of them, or certainly the Regime Change book, is very typical of the hard right now, is that there's a kind of grown-up side to it that looks at the shared world we all live in, points to lots of political and social problems. And Deneen actually comes up with quite imaginative, serious ideas about how we might solve them. I mean, just to give you examples of his policy ideas from Regime Change, which I think came out last year. Civilian national service, workers on company boards, and there were others like that.
Sounds like the left to me.
Indeed, reading part of the book, it sounds like social progressive left. And this is a connection with Hungary. Orban, remember, was used to be a communist, I believe.
Yeah, and he was originally financed by Soros.
Absolutely. Well, Soros was not a communist, but beforehand, before the big change. So there's a very strong component of what used to be called social Catholicism.
Which isn't, I had a fellow on the show, this is his Regime Change Towards a Post-Liberal Future.
Yeah.
People used to talk about post-liberal futures in the early 20th century, which of course resulted in the F word, Edmund. Are there elements, fragments of early fascism in the work of people like Deneen and these other?
Can we? I will certainly answer that, but just to finish on Deneen, the other aspect of his book, it's so funny. There are these, serious policy proposals, but frankly, to get into congressional redistricting, workers on boards, the details of a civilian national service, it's frankly rather boring. Whereas what he suggests for America, namely a kind of national populism directed by a virtuous, presumably fairly Christian, if not Catholic elite.
Like J.D. Vance.
It sounds like kind of Iran in the United States. It sounds like a theocracy. So that is the takeaway in the book that gets attention. And that is really quite, I think that's what will get people like me and Mark Liller quite anxious and alarmed. There is a strong Catholic tradition of that kind of authoritarian view that the people, particularly modern people, are not really able to look after themselves. They can't be relied on to do the right thing.
And coming back to the fascism question, I know you're going to come back to it. In the 1930s, of course, there were many Catholic sympathizers with the extreme right in Central Europe.
The Catholic parties, not Catholics, one can't generalize about all Catholics, but the Catholic parties first in Italy and then in Germany.
And in Slovakia and in
but
Hungary.
in Italy and Germany, they bottled. At the moment when the left and the center, including the Catholic parties, should have said, hey, this is no good. Mussolini, Hitler, this is a road to perdition. The Catholic parties bottled, and they said, well, it's better than Bolshevism, and we better, we'll control Mussolini, we'll control Hitler. And of course, they were wrong. Where I don't think that the present day, the fascist analogy is very useful, is that, that was then, that was almost 100 years ago. Situations are very, very different. And we've also had the experience of how badly it can go wrong if you take that route. I think the danger from the hard right is subtler and less radical.
Edmund, I want to just stay on this for a minute. Another person who has written very critically about Deneen and his crowd is Michael Walzer. Yes, an excellent piece in Liberty's Quarterly, in Notes from a Dangerous Mistake. He's been on the show. I'm sure you're familiar with Walzer. He's an intellectual historian like yourself. Why is it that Deneen is so annoying to intellectual historians like yourself and Walzer? There's more progressives. I mean, I don't think you're quite as far on the left as Walzer. But what is it about the work of Deneen that is just so aggravating?
Well, I think partly that it is clever, and you have to do it's clever. And I mean, you know liberals very well. I mean, if liberals, if
Too
us
well.
liberals
I'm surrounded by them.
have a deep fault, it is self-doubt.
And a lack of humor as well. They don't always. They sometimes struggle to laugh at themselves.
Well, this is one of the big troubles. I mean, it was said of Matthew Arnold. He wasn't quite a liberal, but anyway, sort of 19th century British intellectual. It was said that when he woke up in the morning, everything was an open question to him. And if there, we have a fault, that's liberals. So we read Deneen, and after a few pages, we're absolutely furious, like a cartoon, sort of a cartoon rage. And then we see, well, actually, he has a point or two. He's quite right. He's quite right about this. He's quite right about that. And I think what enrages us is that he's able to dance around and in the end evade some kind of final judgment. He's also quite pretentious, I think. I think the difficulty is that he is quite pretentious, and the complaints he makes about liberalism. I mean, this is going to sound okay, tiny bit tedious, but let's go there. He has some very big end complaints about liberalism. They sound, big stuff. This is philosophy, and he has got some quite big words to talk about it. But actually, when you prod it, it's empty. There's a brilliant book written about 40 years ago by another very good liberal intellectual called Stephen Holmes. And it was called An Anatomy of Anti-Liberalism. And he nailed several of the argumentative tropes that people like Deneen use against liberals.
And I'm not as well schooled in Deneen as you are, or Michael Walzer, but it often seems to me that he's more hostile to capitalism than liberalism.
You see, this is the difficulty. They aren't. I mean, you mentioned, this is one of the things about the hard right, is that it's an amalgam. It's an amalgam of three things: of global capitalism, our nation first welfareists, who want welfare for the ordinary people, and then sort of cultural warriors of some kind about how we should behave. And they're in a kind of tactical alliance, but they don't add up. It's quite obvious that the global capitalists don't want higher taxes, which is the only way you are going to pay for the good social things that people like Deneen recommend. I mean, if you go to a national conservatism conference, you will hear somebody stand up and say, we've got to have low taxes and global commerce. Somebody else stand up and say, we've got to have high welfare, but only for our own people. Well, this is incoherent.
They want their economic cake.
They want their economic cake and
eat it. Borrowing some language from the French Revolution.
Yeah,
I'll take a break in a second, Edmund. But let's say where we began.
Peter Thiel, who's a very good example of it.
Yeah, let's take a break in a second. But I do want to get your take on Keir Starmer. He's perhaps accidentally found himself, he just won the election, in power when there are these riots going on in the UK. What do you make of Starmer's, what seems to me to be a sort of technocratic centrism built around a respect for the law? In many ways, he seems the first chapter in a new experiment that maybe Harris will also pursue. How does Starmer fit in to your books on liberalism and conservatism? He's not much of an intellectual, it would seem, but would he be in either of the books?
Well, he would be in a new edition, certainly. I mean, I very much like the link. I like the link you make between him and Harris, because I think they possibly have something in common, apart from both having been prosecutors, in that, look, what is one of the characteristic emotions of political emotions of the time? It's rage. I mean, it doesn't take much to get, one knows it from one's own experience, even with one's close friends. It doesn't take much nowadays, whether you're arguing about whatever.
To bum a car or beat up an immigrant.
Or the, Gaza war, God, you name it. We're all quite angry. And politics has got very angry. You can go into why, but it has. And I think what's striking about Starmer and about Harris is that Starmer is saying, okay, boring is fine. There's nothing wrong with boring. There's nothing wrong with competent. There's nothing wrong with, plodding on, emphasizing the difficulties and seeing what can be done. That's actually, looking at the last 15, 20 years in my country, that's not a bad message. We have gone through one of the worst examples of kind of collective self-wounding, namely leaving the European Union, that you can imagine. And yet, being Britain, we just, toddle along as if nothing had happened. We're in a very strange state. And Starmer is saying, hey, let's calm down, grow up, stop arguing, and see what can be done to repair things. The left can complain that he isn't, he's not a firebrand. Of course not. But I think that's quite a good message. To come to Harris, I think she's possibly got something that is very, very good as a campaigner, and that is laughter. What is one of the things that bullies absolutely hate? And that is not to be taken seriously. To
be called weird, right? That's what they really hate.
Not even you don't even need to abuse or you don't need to demean or abuse, because that's sort of going to the anger route. But just laughing, it's wonderful. It deflates. It kind of leaves the bully gasping, not knowing what to do. And if Harris can use that in a slightly different way from Starmer's boringness, maybe she can,
Is there a female quality to laughter? I was going to call you Patrick, Edmund. That would have been terrible.
That's okay.
But we can.
It's laughter.
You write a lot about gender, both in both books, and I know in your upcoming book you'll write about it as well. But is there a gender quality to Harris's technocratic humor?
I think there is. I think. Are you saying is there something about humanity in which women laugh at men? I would say from experience, yes. I mean, men can be unbelievably pompous and domineering, and one of the ways that to deflate us is laughter.
We are speaking with. I keep on going to call you Patrick Deneen. You're anything but Patrick Deneen. Edmund Fawcett.
I'm an anti-Patrick Deneen.
He's the anti. He's the un-Deneen because he's not pretentious and he writes about real things. He's the author of two wonderful books, Conservatism, The Fight for Tradition, and Liberalism, The Life of Idea. He's working on a third book on nationalism. We're going to take a short break. Edmund, I want to thank our friends. Your work would be very, very comfortable actually in Liberties, the new quarterly of culture and politics. You should write for them. I'll get you a free subscription as a guest on the show.
Great.
I'm going to run a short feature on Liberties and then we'll be back. And I want to talk more broadly with Edmund about the future of liberalism and conservatism in the 21st century. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second with some more thoughts on the future of conservatism and liberalism.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought, a quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with very much of a Liberties style writer, Edmund Fawcett, the author of Liberalism and Conservatism. I'm not sure which book this came from, Edmund. I think it was from the Liberalism book. But you have this wonderful quote. I'm going to quote it in full. Well, politics chess, liberals had white. They moved first. Conservatives had black. They countered liberalism's opening moves. In time, the initiative changed hands. Conservatives, who began as anti-moderns, came to master modernity. For the right was, in telling ways, the stronger contestant. We talked in the first half of the show about the current state of play. Is the right still the stronger contestant in making sense of modernity?
I think it's the stronger contestant in electoral terms at the moment, in terms of whether it's the stronger in terms of making sense of modernity. I feel like sort of repeating Chow En-lai. It's too early to tell.
Yeah.
The right has enormous strengths. And this is, I think, one of the things that the left, sometimes, we on the left are prone to forget, like a poor chess player. We get wrapped up in our own position and forget that what's important is to think of the best next moves your opponent can make. The right has great strengths. Above all, and this is open to misinterpretation, but in the end, the right is the party of property. Property has hugely changed into this kind of modern political contest began. Lots and lots and lots of people have property now. It's very democratic, it's much wider spread, but still the right speaks for property. This is very crude. The left, on the other hand, has always spoken for equality, for fairness, for a fairer share for everybody. The two are compatible, but they're also easily in contest. The right at the moment seems to be going through a very weird phase. The right came out of the middle of the last century in a very compromising mood. It has seen what disasters liberal democracies could lead to. The collapse into fascism and a terrible world war. And it was determined to avoid that. And in collaboration with the left, with the liberal left, the liberal right did fairly well for 20, 30 years. But since the 1980s, the right has been on a voyage away from that. First in the name of the free market, and now in the name, as we said earlier, not only of the free market, but of a rather imprisoning cultural agenda, very directed against liberalism of one kind or another. So the right is on a strange voyage. If you look at the Tory party in my country, it's absolutely unrecognizable in terms of personnel from how it was even 20 years ago. The liberals and, as it were, to my mind, the grown-ups in the party have either fled or been expunged. And in the United States, you see something similar, in that when I was in Washington 30 or 40 years ago, there was still a stream of liberal Republicans. They were diminishing, but now they don't exist. So you've had the right has, as it were, it's as if it had cut off an important limb. It's also added a kind of angry talk about society, about its opponents, that again, grown-up politics after the middle of the last century had thought, this is bad, we don't go there. This kind of angry politics leads to disasters. And the right, more and more, has embraced that kind of talk. I mean, just listen to a speech by Trump. I mean, it's full of the most outrageous. They're very appealing. They get the crowd on its feet, but they're sort of outrageous, slightly crazy, anger-making suggestions. Similar in France, the what used to be called the Front National, and here, I mean, as we talked about earlier, the Reform Party and many of the people in the Tory party now who sympathize with it, though they don't dare say so, think and talk the same way.
In your excellent book, Conservatism, you break the history of modern conservatism into 4 phases, and you talk about its 4th phase from the 1980s onwards. You call it hyperliberalism and the hard right.
Yep.
Who you've talked about? We talked about Trump. You talked about Farage. You mentioned Le Pen. What about Meloni? Are there models, or Orban? Are there models of contemporary conservatives who are still good chess players, who are reinventing the nature of things as they?
Well, you mentioned Meloni, and I don't have kind of any fingertip feel for Italian politics. Whatever I had, I lost long ago. But my sense from the outside is that Meloni has some political skills, some sense of both what's doable within the Italian system and what is wearable with her opposite numbers in the chancelleries of Europe and the United States. I think she's probably quite an accomplished and grown-up politician. If you don't like her politics, you might think that's a bad thing because it makes her rather a better opponent. The National Front in France, what are they called? The Rallye National in France, there it's harder to tell. What's striking in France is that they've now got the most recent election, the hard right got 32% of the vote, which is an astonishing figure.
Should we be using this term, Edmund, the hard right? Is it a liberal invention to define people they don't like?
Many of my, I have 2 or 3 very dear, very close, very brilliant conservative friends. And I've been using the term for about 6 years. And they say to me, Edmund, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but you mustn't use this term hard right.
I mean, it's like the way that conservatives used to describe the hard left.
Well, I don't. It would be bumptious and conceited to claim that I coined it. I never did that, but I did begin to use it about 6 or 7 years ago in print at a time when it hadn't become the standard word. I think now it's become completely standard. People talk about the hard right as they talked about the hard left. What's the justification for it? I think 2 things. One is that the right in question is no longer extreme. Go back to the 1960s or 70s, and people would happily talk about the extreme right, and you knew who they were talking about. They were talking about Le Pen in the 1960s and 70s in France, or they were talking about a few lunatic neo-fascists in Germany.
Or Enoch Powell.
Well, I'd like to come back to Enoch Powell. He's a very interesting study. Indeed, Enoch Powell. He was the extreme right, but they're not extreme any longer. They're mainstream. You can't possibly talk about a party that gets 32% of the vote as extreme. Okay, so they're not extreme, nor are they new. They've been around for a very, very long time. That was the other expression for them, the new right, as if to suggest that this was somehow an alternative, a minority, a little party in waiting. That was a very common word, but they're not. They've taken over. The hard right has taken over, certainly in my country, in Britain. It's taken over the Tory party, and I would say it's taken over the Republican Party. In France and Germany, there is still the party structures are slightly different, but there is still a center-right party that isn't hard right, but the hard right is very strong in both places. So I think the hard right, in purely descriptive terms, is quite justified. And indeed, it's striking how it's become.
Is it going to become harder? I mean, at what point does it become, without wishing to sound too Freudian here, too hard?
It is. It's a funny. Yes, one doesn't really want to go there. The suggestiveness of the phrase "hard." This comes back to your question about fascism. I mean, I think the institutional strength and the sheer variety and complexity of our societies and politics now make the kind of domination by a single party under a charismatic leader highly improbable. That said, can the hard right become harder? Well, let's take one example of phlegmatic, sensible, commonsensical Britain. What have we done in the last 10 years? we have, by collective decision, very narrow, but still, by collective decision, we have wounded ourselves, we have isolated ourselves from world politics in a way that I think historians will look back on and they will puzzle as to why this could have happened, a kind of national madness. And we left the European Union. So that's one example of how hard the right can become. Of course, being Britain, everybody now pretends this hasn't happened, but it has, and we will live, and my grandchildren and their children will live with the consequences for a long time. And I think in your country, in the United States, if Trump wins the election, I think one of the harder aspects or hardening of the hard right you may see is a open attack on the federal government.
Which is implicit in what he's saying.
In much of what they say.
What he's saying, certainly his message is less veiled.
It will take a very particular form in the United States. And I think J.D. Vance has actually said it quite clearly, is that they want to, in effect, fire many layers at the top of the federal civil service.
That's the urbanization.
By removing civil service protection from the job.
It's the urbanization or the Erdoganization of
absolutely, and making them political appointments. So I forget what it was called. Was it called the Yellow Book in Washington? Which was a new administration would have, which would be a long list of all the new jobs they could put political appointees into. And it was quite a thin volume at the time, because you could only do it down to the level of, I think, assistant secretary in the departments. Now it's going to be a quite thick volume. And the Trump hard Republicans will get rid of a great number of people who up until then had civil service protection.
It'll be
politicization of the federal government.
It'll be the required reading of historians in addition to Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. Anne Applebaum, another old friend of the show, has a new book out. I think it's called Autocracy, Inc., in which she connects all this with Putin. There are a new wave, I think, of cold warriors who make Putin the engine of all this. How do the Farages and the Trumps and the Orbans, how closely associated are they with Moscow, in your view?
I don't think there may be, but no doubt there are personal connections. There are lots of channels. There are lots of linkages. There are lots of similarities. But I think one needs to be quite clear. Putin's, what created Putinism were historic dysfunctions in the Soviet Union and the state that succeeded it. I don't think that, I don't see Putin in Trump or in the Brexiteers I don't think it works that way. Or in even in somebody like Meloni, I think it's very different. They are still operating in a liberal democratic system with a reasonably independent judiciary. There are no political prisoners in the United States and across Western Europe and in Britain. Political opponents are not disposed of. Organized crime is persistent, but is not out of control. There are so many differences between the ex-Soviet Union and the countries we're talking about, that I think analogies between the two kinds of politics are different. I haven't read Anne's book, and I have enormous respect for her, both as a journalist and a writer. But I think that kind of analogy distracts us from where the dangers from the hard right come in our societies.
Let's end, Edmund, with a return to your wonderful chess analogy and the chessboard. Are Harris and Starmer's, I don't know, technocratic, sensible, non-ideological or post-ideological approaches, are they the way in which the left or progressives or liberals, whatever you want to call them, particularly liberals, are they the way they should play this game? It seems as if there's a preoccupation amongst liberals with the Trumps and the Orbans and the Melonis and Le Pens of the world, and their ideology is essentially just, if you're against these people, then that's enough. Do they need to be a little bit more innovative? Do we need to find a real liberalism for the 21st century? As I said, I went to this event in DC last month. Fukuyama ended it, but I think everyone's still scratching around for the outlines of what liberalism should look like in the 21st century.
I think that's hyper right down the line, Andrew. I think there is a terrible danger that we have such a fat, left intellectuals, we find we have such a fat target on the right to get preoccupied.
Very fat in the United States.
Indeed, it's fat. It's fat for us. It's fat for you. It's fat across Western Europe. It's very easy to get preoccupied that. No, I think, to me, what is vital is that the liberals of the left and the left itself, maybe the sort of the anti-liberal left, they have to come together and they have to accept that a lot of the problems that the Western liberal democratic societies are facing cannot be solved with sort of angry, pointless disputation. They're going to have to be solved at the center by right-wing liberals, by left-wing liberals, and with at least the cooperation, if the acquiescence, if not the cooperation of the left. That's a huge project, but I think that's the only grown-up one that faces us.
But where's the, brings to mind the Popular Front of the 1930s. Where does this innovation, Edmund, come from? A lot of talk, particularly on the West Coast where I live, on networks and the role of digital technology, local democracy, citizen assemblies, reform of politics, obviously the old New Deal economics. Where do you think the most vital, and in your chess metaphor, the best winning strategy should be for liberals in the second, and we're almost in the second quarter of the 21st century?
Yeah. Well, I think like many of these movements, I think it'll grow from think tanks, from universities, from political journals.
Oh dear,
but
that's not good.
It seems to me,
then when won't we end up with ideology by committee?
Grow. I mean, that's where the hard right came from. The hard right came from speeches and speechwriters and journals that are now forgotten in the 1960s and 70s.
Are there young liberals then?
But, I mean, don't knock the think tanks, and I think that's where the ideas will come from. The policy ideas for this recreation of a liberalism for the 21st century. But above all, I think what is needed is an openness to the idea of coalition politics and what you call a popular front. You had it in France, and it kind of wasn't a desperately encouraging example.
Doesn't sound very innovative. I mean, you earlier in your career, very early in your career, you worked at New Left Books, and you were involved with Rolling Stone magazine. Yeah. Where's the really interesting new thinking coming from, Edmund?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I think if you want interesting new thinking, you have to go to the think tanks.
Well, give me some names.
I haven't any names at the moment. Well, I have actually. There is one in Britain, the Resolution Foundation, which is a very good example of what I'm talking about. It's run by run by two people. One is David Willits, who is an old Thatcherite or a young Thatcherite minister who has actually moved very, very much to the center of politics. I think he might still call himself a conservative, but he's very liberal conservative. And there is its director is somebody called Torsten Bell, who was, I think, elected as a Labour MP you could correct me. That is a very good example of exactly the kind of think tank that I'm talking about. It's completely grown up. It does very, very good analyses of the social problems, economic problems that this country is facing. If you say new ideas, Rolling Stone, New Left, in a way, that was a wonderful time and that was very important. But it's very easy to come up with a radical new idea. Somebody says black, you say white. That isn't what we're facing. What we're facing is what the Resolution Foundation, to give an example, gives us, which is very detailed, patient explanations and accounts of the social problems we're facing with ideas of how to solve it. And above all, they're bipartisan. I think if liberalism has a future in the next few decades, I think that's the only way to go. And I think you probably, this is beyond my knowledge, I think you'd find similar think tanks in France and Germany, possibly even in the United States.
Well, we'll have to get someone from the Resolution Foundation on the show.
I
Edmund
recommend
Fawcett.
it.
And we'll get you back. Edmund Fawcett, the author of Liberalism and Conservatism. It's always so refreshing to talk to someone with such a comprehensive and meta view of our current political opportunities and dilemmas. Thank you so much, and we'll talk again in the not too distant future.
I hope so. I'm glad to see Ernst Lubitsch on the cover of Liberty.